what to do with, so I'd welcome your feedback either after or by email, or just pop by to see me. So the sort of taking off point for this is that the world population is projected to reach 7 billion in 2011. It's an important demographic milestone, has a lot of discussion going on about the challenges of growing world population. The last billion was added in just 12 years, which is about the same as the billion before that. So that's pretty sobering rapid additions to world population. So as we look ahead to the challenges of this rapid growth of world population, my idea was to look back at the last 50 years, go back to the 60s, think about what world population growth looked like then, look at the experience of the last 50 years and see what lessons we can learn. So let's go back, so time warp, or go back to the 60s. This is the cover of Time magazine from January 1960. The world population reached 3 billion then. It was very widely noted and very widely discussed. As you can tell, the Time did one of its first covers of the year on the 3 billion. It's actually quite a nice article. You can find all of these old Time magazine articles, very well researched, very interesting. And as they pointed out, the addition of that 3rd billion from 2 billion took about 30 years, which, as they pointed out then, was historically unprecedented. That, as we now know, the previous billion before that was probably 150 years, and the previous billion before that was from the beginning of mankind. So it was noted as an important milestone, lots of discussion of what it was going to mean. So the 3 billion was an interesting milestone. Another, maybe even more important milestone, was that the world population growth rate was hitting unprecedented levels, got up to 2%, depending on whether you use the Census Bureau's measures or the UN's measures, somewhere 1962 to 1964, that the world population grew at 2% a year, probably for the first time ever in human history, because as we'll see, growing at 2% is not that easy to do. So these high population growth rates were causing a lot of response, including the founding of many population centers like the University of Michigan's in 1961, and many others during the decade. That, of course, 2% growth rate implies a doubling of world population in 35 years. Many people discussed it, many people worked on it, and one of the kind of emblematic works of the period was Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. So I don't want to make this all about Paul Ehrlich, but it's an important focus. As you can see here, Ehrlich wrote, while you're reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. Population control, a race to oblivion. A quite disturbing picture of the demographic challenges that were facing the world at that time. Ehrlich's book was certainly not the only book on the topic. Many people wrote books looking at the demographic challenges. And I'll come back to some of these predictions and what actually happened shortly. First, I want to talk a little bit about how exceptional the demographic experience of the 1960s really was. Was it really unusual? Well, here's the 3 billion in 1960. Here's 6 billion in 1999. That's doubling, in addition to 3 billion, a doubling in 39 years. How unusual is that? Well, the previous doubling took about 70 years. Many of you will know this if you've looked at these numbers, back to roughly 1890. We're getting into very rough approximations here. The doubling before that was probably about 150 years, back to, say, 1740 in round numbers. The doubling before that, to get back to about 375,000 people, was probably about 12 40, or about 500 years, and the doubling before that goes back to about 1 AD and 1,200 years. So it's interesting to think about the sequence of doubling time. So how long has it taken world population to double? And if we thought about it that way, the doubling time starting back when we were this many doubling times ago would be 1,200 years, 500 years, 50 years, 70 years, 39 years. So I like to play the game with my economic demography class of what's the next number in this sequence. That is to say, how long will it be from the time, from the 6 billion time, the 39 years from 1960 to 1999, till we get to 12 billion. So that's the challenge, is to guess that. So I give my students choices like this: 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Have them raise their hands. Generally, they've all raised their hand by the time I get to 40 years. You would probably want some additional choices: 60 years, 100 years, over 100 years. And any of you who've looked at this kind of data would know that the correct answer is almost surely over 100 years. And in fact, if you've done any of these projections, you might even like some more choices, like over 1,000 years, or maybe even forever. Because it's very plausible that, in fact, the world population will never get to 12 billion. So that's a pretty strong statement. How could we say that, and given all the uncertainty? And to see that, basically the best thing to do is to look at population growth rates and then look at the components. Okay, so just quickly to get through, let's first look at the projected population by the UN Population Division. So there's our 3 billion to 6 billion, then we're up to 7 billion. What does the UN project? Well, they have three projections. They have their medium, high, and low variants. The medium variant projects it by 2050. The world will be at 9.1 billion, the high variant at 10.5, and the low variant at 8 billion. So none of these would have us doubling in anywhere close to 40 years. The 8 billion is projected to take about another 13 or 14 years, not that much different than the one we just added, but the one after that will be about 25 years. And by then the growth rates will be extremely low, and very almost inconceivable that there would be a doubling in anything like 100 years. Let's look at the growth rates. These are some historical estimates just based on rough data points, but the world probably never grew at 0.5% per year until the Industrial Revolution. In the 20th century, it got up to 1%. We then get to I'm going to use here the annual estimates made by the Census Bureau starting in 1950. The big blip there in 1959 is the estimate of the demographic consequences of the China Great Famine. To recover from that, the Census Bureau's estimates are that the peak world population growth rate was 2.2% in 1963. The UN has population division's numbers are sort of smooth estimates based on its 5-year numbers, and they would have the peak at a little over 2% in 1968. So pretty similar story. 2% growth rates in the 60s and rapid declines since then. The current population growth rate of the world is a little over 1%, or a doubling in about 65 years at that rate. These three projections, the medium variant projection of the UN would have the growth rate down to only 0.3% by 2050, actually negative by their low variant projection. The world actually reaches a peak of 8 billion before 2050, and their high variant, which you can see already from the outset is a little implausible, but the growth rate ends up at about 0.8%. Okay, so those growth rates are clearly going to make it very unlikely that the world gets to 12 billion population anytime in the foreseeable future or even in the unforeseeable future. Now, to understand why these are, how can we be so confident of these, and to really understand the whole consequences of population growth, you've got to look at what caused all this to happen, and as you will all appreciate, that means at least a quick tour through the demographic transition, which I think is absolutely fundamental to understand what's going on here. Okay, so you all know about the demographic transition. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but I just want to show you what it looks like for the world using the UN data, for which we can begin in 1950. So in 1950, the demographic transition for the world is well underway. Death rates have already declined to 20 per thousand. Birth rates are up at about 38 per thousand. And of course, to get 2% population growth, you need this gap. You need a gap between the birth rate and the death rate of 20 per thousand. And part of the point to appreciate here is why we're very unlikely to ever see growth rates like that again. With death rates down to 10 per thousand by 2010, you would have to have birth rates of 30 per thousand or so to ever get growth rates again. And of course, the birth rates are rapidly going down. So the rate of natural increase, the population growth rate implied by these, was a little below 2% in the 50s, got up to 2% in the 60s, and has been declining since. Now let's just look at some regions. For Southeast Asia, actually had the highest population growth rates in the 1950s because it had had the fastest declines in the death rate. So the death rate was already down to almost 20 per thousand in the 1950s, so Thailand would be a good typical example here. So the growth rate was up to over 2.5% per year in the 1960s, and then rapidly falling since then. And as you can see, we're down to about 1% by 2010. And it's only as high as that because of the high numbers of women in childbearing age. So as we'll see, the total fertility rate in Southeast Asia is actually down to around replacement level, which means that the population growth rate would actually be zero once the population momentum, all of the women of childbearing ages, have worked their way through the age distribution. Okay. Which is one of the reasons why those growth rates are projected to go down so fast. Latin America looks very similar. There's an interesting feature here, which is this little rise in the death rate in the last decade. That's not because of worsening mortality. Quite the contrary, mortality continues to improve. That's because of the aging of the population. So death rates, in fact, are going up in most countries that are well through the demographic transition because the populations are getting older. Okay, so these are just crude death rates, deaths as a percent of the total population. So yet another reason why we're very unlikely to ever go back to growth rates of 2%. Okay, that's Latin America, that's South Asia. This is Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is certainly a special case. The birth rate, as we can see, is still very high. The death rate was falling at a somewhat slower rate when the story begins here in the 1950s. It's now down to almost 10 per thousand, very similar to almost every other country in the world, every other region. The birth rate fell more slowly, and so the growth rate actually lagged a bit behind other regions, but then grew more rapidly, got up to 3% in the 1980s, and has been declining. And for many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, growth rates actually got up as high as 4% per year, or doubling times of 16 or 17 years. Okay, so that's the demographic transition. It's very important to set the stage for everything that comes. And it also makes it clear why we're really through the worst of the population growth. This doubling in 40 years and 39 years, you can see why it never happened before. It's never going to happen again. And in terms of, if we imagine that we're running experiments on the human race of how much can we handle, it's as if we sort of crank the electricity up to ever before seen levels to see whether we could handle it. Okay, so we've been through a period of absolutely unprecedented population growth rates that we will never see again. Okay, so what happened? So I'm going to look at food production, poverty, commodity prices, education, as sort of indicators of what happens. Let's start with food production. Food is one of the big issues. It's certainly fundamental, getting a lot of attention at the moment. A lot of gloomy predictions were made about food. Here's one that Paul Ehrlich made in The Population Bomb. The world is rapidly running out of food. The battle to feed humanity is already lost. We will not be able to prevent large-scale famines in the next decade. Many other people made predictions like this. Is not just sort of picking one to pick on as a straw man. It was a very common prediction of the time, and we'll see not without reason. So what happened? Let's just first look at the period from 1960 to 1980. So this is based on Food and Agriculture Organization data, indexed to 1961. And so total food production looks like this. Very impressive output. The 156 means that food production was 56% higher in 1980 than it was in 1960. What happened to population? Well, population, as we saw, was growing at 2% a year, so it went up a lot, went up 43%, but a little bit more slowly than food production. So per capita food production actually increased steadily over the period. 10% higher in 1980 than it was in 1960. I've stopped in 1980 because there were a lot of concerns about what was going to happen in the 80s. A quote here from Lester Brown. Lester Brown shows up a lot in this literature. He's written a zillion books, founder of the World Watch Institute and now the Earth Policy Institute. His quote in an article in Science, as the 1980s begin, the growth in world production is losing momentum and its excess over population is narrowing. So what happened after there? Well, that's where we were. There's food production till 2009, there's population, there's per capita food production. So actually no evidence of any slowdown. Very impressive gains. The world's producing 3 times as much food today as it was in 1960. The population is 2 times what it was in 1960, so there's 41% higher food production per capita. Now that's the world as a whole, and that might be misleading because we're of course concerned about particular regions. One of the regions we were most concerned about in the 1960s was India. India was a big focus of Ehrlich's book, a big focus of many other discussions at the time. Of course, a very large population then, as now it's a very large fraction of the world, and certainly of the developing world. In Ehrlich's book, he has a long discussion about India food production. He quotes the agricultural economist Louis Bean, who said that it looked to him like India would never be able to produce more food than it was producing in 1967 to 68. Well, let's look at India food production from the same FAO source. We'll do up to 1990 here. There's food production in India, and it is worth noting that the 60s were not going well for food production in India, so these predictions were not crazy. There had been almost no increase in food production from 1960 to about 1967, and so understandable that people predicted that there were hard times ahead. Now, in 1967-68 was when the Green Revolution technologies were introduced. They were actually developed in Mexico, the main hybrid yields. They were taken to India and Pakistan. They were phenomenally successful, and you can see these very sharp increases in food production starting about 1968, about the time of Ehrlich's book was published. So for India's food production increased 2.3 times by 1990. Population was growing very fast, faster than the rest of the world, and increased almost doubled in this 30-year period. So per capita food production actually lagged behind till about 1970. There were declines, and then it began to increase, and it was about 20% higher in 1990 than it was in 1960. So a big success story, very much related to these high-yield variety Green Revolution seeds and agricultural processes. But concern was looming here in around 1990. One more quote from Paul Ehrlich. This is actually from an update of the population bomb called The Population Explosion, published in 1990. This quote, since 1983, India's grain production has lost momentum. It's actually hard to see that in the graph, but data at the time may have shown that. The country appears to be facing a catastrophic problem in the 1990s. So what happened in the 1990s, there's where we were, there's food production after 1980, there's population, there's per capita food production. The 1980s were actually a phenomenally successful period for food production in India, some of the greatest growth rates of the entire period, and ending up with food production, per capita food production 37% higher today than it was in the 1960s. Now, there are lots of things you can see here. One is that there are good years and bad. There are little downward blips here. Food production, especially within a given country, can have significant bad years and significant good years. And one important lesson is to sort of look at the big picture. Certainly the big picture for India is of enormous success in food production. Sub-Saharan Africa, not so great. But on the other hand, a somewhat of a mixed picture. So this is, I'll just do the whole period from 60 to 2010. There's total food production. So actually, I think people are sometimes surprised to see this at how successful Africa was. They're producing 3 times as much food today as they were in 1960. That's an impressive accomplishment. Unfortunately, population is 3.6 times today what it was in 1960. Enormous increases in population that are continuing, so that per capita food production has actually declined by 7% from 1960. So challenges there, but not an entirely gloomy picture, because certainly if one gets the impression that nothing has happened in Africa since 1960, that's definitely not the case. There's enormous increased productivity, just not fast enough to keep up with population. Okay. I want to talk about prices. Now, to economists, if you want to talk about running out of stuff, there's no better thing to look at than prices. Non-economists don't necessarily always agree with that. But to economists, if you're about to run out of something, you probably see the price of it going up. It's very hard to believe that you're about to run out of something, especially something that's privately owned or owned by governments, and see the prices go down. And I wanted to make this quote. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. It's very appropriate to this talk. It's actually attributed to about 100 different people, among them Yogi Berra and Niels Bohr. And I want to pause and make this comment at this point, because you could say, well, it's easy to go back and find predictions made in the 60s and find that they were inaccurate, and lucky for us that we didn't make any predictions in the 1960s to anybody to go back and look at. But some people did better than others. For example, Julian Simon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Julian Simon. Very interesting character. Economist, frequent attender of PAA in the early 1980s when I first began going to PAA, and author of this book called The Ultimate Resource. So a bit of a gadfly. His approach can pretty much be summed up by this quote on the cover here: "Every trend in material human welfare has been improving and promises to continue to do so indefinitely." So you can't get much more optimistic than that. And basically what he does in this book is has page after page of graphs of iron prices and lead prices and copper prices, and shows them going down for 200 years. And the ultimate resource, from the title, refers to man's creativity, basically, humanity's creativity in dealing with problems. So there are all the resources that we're worried about running out of. His argument is the ultimate resource is our own ability to solve problems. Julian Simon died in 1998, and I'm not sure, certainly has not had the enduring fame of Paul Ehrlich, but is an interesting character to enter into the story here. So in this book, actually in the introduction, I believe, Simon makes this quote. He says he's prepared to pay the current, if you're prepared to pay the current market price for $1,000 worth of any mineral, he'll pay the market price of the same amount in any future date. So just to restate, what he's doing is offering to bet anybody that the price of any mineral they choose will be lower in the future than it was in 1980 when he wrote this. So a pretty audacious bet. He actually came through Berkeley when I was a graduate student and announced this bet and was making a big deal of it. And Paul Ehrlich took him up on it. And some of you may know this story, very nicely told by John Tierney in a New York Times magazine piece shortly after the bet came to its conclusion in 1990. So Ehrlich and some of his colleagues from Stanford, they got to pick the minerals, they got to pick the date in the future, so they picked 1990, and they picked these 5 minerals. So the way the bet worked was they basically entered into a futures contract. They took $200 worth of each of these 5 minerals, so they cost $1,000 in 1980. And then 1990, the question was, what could you buy those for in 1990? And the answer is $200 of copper you could buy in 1990 for $163, chrome for $120, nickel for $193, tin for $56, and tungsten for $86. These are all inflation-adjusted prices, although even if you didn't adjust for inflation, the prices went down. So the $1,000 worth of minerals in 1980 cost $618 in 1990. So Ehrlich had to write Simon a check for the difference. Okay, so that was a pretty interesting bet. As I said, in some ways a more audacious prediction to say that the price of any mineral you pick will be lower in the future than it is today, than it was to predict mass starvation in India given the conditions of the time. Now, this is actually the prices of all these things from 1960 to 2010, and you'll see that, in fact, the picture is a little more complicated. There's the price of tungsten, there's the price of tin, there's the price of copper, there's the price of nickel, there's the price of chromium, there's the 1980 to 1990. So Simon in some ways got a little lucky. If the bet had ended in 1989, nickel and chromium would have actually cost more, although the total package still would have been a bit lower. You can see that these prices have a lot of volatility. They're traded in very active commodities markets with lots of speculation. They bounce all over. But you can also see that there is this, they went up a bit in the 70s. Then they went down quite a lot, all of them, until about 2000. And then there's been an increase since then. So if you'd made the bet from 2000 to 2010, you would definitely have lost money. Ehrlich would have won. And there's this recent big increase in commodity prices that's getting a lot of attention. And I'll talk a little bit more later. Here's the price of food, which is getting a lot of discussion, from 1960 to 2010. You can see that it went down for a long period and has recently been going up, but there's a big, significant drops. The price of food in 2000 was about half the price in 100. This is an index made by the World Bank that's a combination of a lot of food prices. This is the price of non-energy commodities. Food's a big part of that, so it tracks it pretty well. This is the price of energy. So no big surprise, there's a huge spike here. I should have commented on the 1974 spike in food prices. That, as you might guess, is related to OPEC. Energy is a big component in producing food. And you had a huge spike there. Oil prices have gone up like crazy in the last few years. So that's what's been happening to prices. So what could we conclude from it? Well, obviously a mixed bag. A long period of declines. Take energy out of the story where OPEC plays a huge kind of non-market role. Certainly over this period when world population was doubling from 1960 to 2000, I don't think anybody would have thought that food prices and the prices of the all non-energy commodities would be half in 2000 what they were in 1960. Pretty amazing given that the world population was doubling. Okay, let me move on to poverty. So poverty is a good measure because it certainly goes to the heart of what a lot of people were concerned about. Not just, would the world on average survive, but what would happen to poor people in developing countries. The World Bank has spent a lot of time trying to make consistent estimates of poverty. They only go back to 1981, but that's still pretty interesting. Here's their estimate of the poverty rate measured as less than $1.25 per day per capita consumption of households. That rate was a little over 50% in 1981. It's fallen by half of that to 25% in 2005. They also have a $2 per day measure, which hasn't fallen quite as much. China, as you probably know, plays an enormous role in this. They've had a huge decline in poverty. If we take China out, we don't get quite the big dramatic improvements, but we do get a decline from 40% in poverty to 29% in poverty. So again, pretty remarkable in a period when population was growing so fast. If you look at the number in poverty, there's actually still a modest decline. So population doubling from 60 to 2000, going up by about 50% from 80 to 2000, and yet the decline in the percentage in poverty was fast enough to offset that, and there's actually fewer people in poverty today than there were in 1980, and undoubtedly many fewer than in 1960. At the $2 a day measure, it's just about flat, kind of goes up a little and then down. If we take out China, there's actually a little bit of an increase because China accounts for so much of the decline. If we look at different regions, East Asia, this would include China, has by far the most dramatic decline. It's a staggering improvement from about 80% in poverty to about 15%. Latin America had low poverty to begin with. It hasn't improved a lot, about 10%. It's been declining a little. South Asia, including India, has had a decline from 60 to about 45%. And Sub-Saharan Africa, as we might guess, has not done as well. Has not had a big increase, but has basically not made any progress in reducing poverty. So big challenges continue there. Now, let me try to very quickly talk about how we survived, assuming you're willing to accept the premise that we did survive, which I'll hopefully have time to talk about a little bit at the end. I want to emphasize three things under economics and then three things under sort of arbitrarily classified as demography. Under economics, market responses, innovation, and globalization. I'm not going to say a lot about any of these. They're just what I think rise to the top of the list of reasons the world was able to respond. By market responses, I mean things like when the price of food starts to go up, people grow more of it. People respond to the prices that are induced by these changes. When the prices of these scarce minerals go up, people find substitutes for them. People find other ways to use them. The story in those 5 minerals that Ehrlich and Simon bet on is full of stories of cartels collapsing because of people finding synthetic alternatives and finding other ways of doing things. Just as an example is the case of Vietnam. This is just another one of these food production graphs. But I mention it because you can see it had this enormous increase in food production from 1960 of 5-fold increase in food production. Population went up about half that. So a more than doubling of per capita food production. And I wanted to point out the economic liberalizations that happened between 81 and 89. So Vietnam is often used as an example of a case where farms were decollectivized, there were much more incentives for farmers to produce, and there was a staggering response of increased agricultural output over this period. The Doi Moi reforms were in 1986, but liberalization and greater incentives for production began in 1981 and were followed by this incredible productive period. These are just growth rates of GDP in India and China. They jump around a lot, of course. These are even 5-year averages. But India and China, even with lower rates with the recession, are growing at rates of over 7% and 11% per year in GDP. And one of the points here is that population growth definitely, I think, creates challenges for economies. We have various models of how to model what the negative effect of a higher population growth rate would be. And one version of it would basically be that if you had a 1% higher population growth, your per capita income would grow 1% more slowly. That's what you'd get from a solo neoclassical growth model because capital gets diluted. That's what you'd get if you just had fixed resources and added people at a 1% higher rate. One way to think of this is to think that, we'd all love to have 1% higher returns on our CDs or our stock portfolio. But if you really want to get rich, the way to do it is to buy Microsoft when it was $10 a share. The point here is that the way countries reduce poverty and become the kind of rapidly becoming middle-income countries that China and India are, is growing at 8, 9, 10%, 11% per year. Okay? That can completely wipe away the negative effects of 1% or 2% growth. So the point is not that population growth doesn't create problems for economic development, but that it can be completely overwhelmed by the returns to deregulation, which these countries have had greatly. I'll just put up Brazil here. Brazil did even better in the 60s and may not look that impressive here, but this rise up to 3.7% growth, and it was about 4.5% before that, is much better than they were having in the 1980s and is again due to a big market liberalization. At least that's what I and many others would argue. Okay, innovation is obviously important. I mentioned the Green Revolution. The poster man here for innovation has to be Norman Borlaug. He's the guy who was in Mexico inventing these high-yield variety crops, took them to India and Pakistan in the late 1960s, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, generally called the father of the Green Revolution. The usual indicator of these successes is yields. So this is output per hectare, which have more than doubled in wheat, more than doubled in rice as well from 1961 to 2010 for the world as a whole, and similar, even more staggering increases in India, especially in wheat. Okay, so that's innovation. There are many other innovations one could mention. Computers, all kinds of better ways of making just about everything that gets made. And one important point about this is that we could think of Norman Borlaug actually got a lot of support from the Rockefeller Foundation. To some extent, it was manna from heaven that he came up with these high-yield varieties. On the other hand, this was really very much a response to the pressures being caused by population. In many ways, a kind of exactly the sort of thing that Esther Boserup predicted would happen. The pressures of population lead to innovations, and that's certainly what we see here. So these things did not just come out of thin air. They were in many ways a response, and much of this increased productivity is also itself a market response. There's a lot of money to be made in selling high-yield variety seeds and for farmers in growing them. I mentioned globalization. I don't want to say too much about that, but I think it's a very important part of the story. One measure of it is just exports as a percent of GDP. That's what we see in high-income countries, a huge increase in global trade over the period from 1960, but even bigger increase for low and middle-income countries, which many of which had very protectionist policies in the 60s, abandoned those for open trade policies. Those are often criticized, as are market policies in general, but the success of these really can't be overstated. These are enormous increases. Another manifestation of this increased trade is the compartmentalization of production, which production now takes place all over the world, and countries like India and China have certainly benefited enormously from it. Okay, so here's some of the economic forces that have caused us to do so well in this period, sort of against all odds. Then I have three things I want to somewhat arbitrarily put under the heading demography. One is urbanization. Two is, in many ways, the most obvious, which is fertility decline. And three is investments in children, which I'm putting under demography because it's very closely linked to the fertility decline. Urbanization, many of you know this story. This is, again, the total population of the world as projected by the UN, getting up to 9.1 billion by 2050. This is the projection of the urban population. This is the projection of the rural population. The rural population, the urban population caught up with the rural population in 2009, and the rural population of the world is estimated to be reaching its peak just about now or in the next few years. Why is this important and an interesting part of the story? Well, I would argue that it's cities and towns that were able to absorb this doubling of world population. For the most part, they were not absorbed in the rural areas where they were in the 1950s. Rural places became urban simply by getting larger, but also many people moved to towns and cities. If we look at this across regions, Latin America reached a peak in the 1970s, East Asia in the 1980s. So the rural population's actually been declining. The rural population of Brazil in 2000 is about the same as it was in 1940. So population growth did not get absorbed in the rural areas. It got absorbed by people moving to towns and cities. There's Southeast Asia. The peak is about to be reached. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa will keep growing the rural population until 2050, but that's a point at which the total population is projected to be growing at almost 2% a year. I just want to mention a new book by Edward Glaser, economist at Harvard, called Triumph of the City. Makes some of the points that I think are important here. Calls cities mankind's greatest invention, arguing that you can do in cities everything better, you can make jobs better, you can produce things more efficiently, and really cities are really the key to how the world managed to absorb a doubling in 40 years. Need to say a little bit more about fertility decline. This is the total fertility rate for the world. Most of you will know this story. It's declined by about 50%. If you, as Ronald Friedman used to like to do, make the benchmark not zero, but replacement fertility of 2.1, we'll call it, it's an 82% decline relative to replacement fertility. So it's a staggering decline in world fertility over this period that we're talking about, and certainly absolutely fundamental in understanding how the world was able to survive. If we look at it across regions, there's the enormous decline in East Asia, Latin America, and Southeast Asia look a lot the same. As you can see, they're almost down to replacement fertility. And as I said, the only reason they're growing at 1% still is because of population momentum, the large numbers of women in childbearing age. There's South Asia, and there's Sub-Saharan Africa, again, lagging behind a bit. Okay. I have a section here about why fertility fell so fast. I'm clearly not going to be able to go through it, so I'm just going to skip over it. It's a complicated story about retelling of Lant Pritchett's paper about wanted fertility and unwanted fertility. I'll tell you what the bottom line is. is this R squared of 0.55, which says that about half of the decline in fertility using DHS estimates for all of these countries is explained by a change in wanted fertility, using a measure created by John Bongartz. And the other half is not explained by decline in wanted fertility. In other words, one could look at this as the people lowered their fertility desires, and that's why fertility went down. That's about half of it. The other half is attributable perhaps to increased family planning services. Okay, investments in children. Education went up enormously over this period, and in some ways this is one of the most amazing accomplishments. So here's primary schooling in Brazil for looking at cohorts, and we're looking at them at the year that they turned age 10. Why age 10? Because that's when they were in school, and I want to compare them to cohort sizes around the same time. So you can see in Brazil, the proportion with primary schooling went from 20% up to 70%. The schooling for females passed the schooling for males around 1970. We see that all over the world. This is the cohort size, the school-age population in the same time period as is shown the proportion with primary schooling. And what you see here is the increases in the school-age population. School-age population doubles between 1960 and 1980 here. That's a period in which the proportion with primary schooling went up from about 30% up to almost 60%. So very big improvements in schooling. This is the story for Thailand. Even more staggering improvements. And we do see some relationship here to cohort size, in that when the cohort size begins to slow down, it looks like the schooling increases even more. So there's definitely something going on with cohort size, but still huge improvements even in periods when cohorts were growing rapidly. So school-age population in many of these countries was growing at 4% a year through much of the 1970s and 1980s. That's a doubling in 16 or 17 years. And yet schooling went up very rapidly in all of these countries. Even Kenya had big increases and a catch-up of females to males in spite of enormous increases in population. Okay, I was going to have a section here about who gets the credit for increases in schooling. I think I'll skip that. This shows the relationship between children ever born and schooling. So one of the points I want to make is that the shift from large families making low investments in their children to small families making high investments in their children is one of the fundamental dimensions of economic development. To some extent, we see that here in this picture for Brazil. This is a graph of the schooling of 16 to 17-year-olds, who I've picked because they're old enough to have considerable variation in their schooling, but young enough to still be living with their mothers, so that we can get an estimate of their mother's fertility. So what we see here is this is the children born to their mother. This is their schooling, and we see this big negative slope in 1960. If we look across the census years, we can see that schooling goes up, even controlling for children ever born. So if we were to look at the improvements in mean schooling of 16 to 17-year-olds over time in Brazil, one way to think about it would be this way. This X bar, Y bar is the combination of children ever born mean and education mean. You can see it's about 8 children ever born to the school-age children. That's how big their mothers' families are. That's how big their families are. And a fertility rate of about 2.5. And as we go over time, then, we move up the graph this way. So each of these is the mean of children ever born and children's schooling as we go up. And there's a couple of points here. One is that some non-trivial share of this, a fairly significant share of this improvement in schooling. We end up from the lower right point up to the upper left point over these 40 years, is accounted for by what we might think of as movements along the curve. That is, it's due to the fact that we've moved from large families to small families. On the other hand, a big chunk of it is due to the shifts of the lines. Okay, so even if you held fertility constant, you would have had significant improvements in education. So who gets the credit? Well, governments for building schools, parents for making their children go to school, kids for doing their homework and staying in school. Lots of credit to go around for these increases in schooling, but they're absolutely fundamental to understanding the improvements in all of these human conditions over this period. Okay. Quickly, a couple of minutes on have we really survived. So there are a lot of things to worry about in the world still. I'm not going to talk about the youth bulge, though some might be worried about that. But more of you are probably worried about global warming. This is a graph of global warming. This is global average temperature from 1880 to 2000. It's gone up about two full degrees. There are a lot of parts of the story here that are related to this. One is that markets are wonderful things and can solve many problems. One problem they're not good at solving is pollution and things like global warming. These are not things that are getting properly priced. They don't give people incentives to reduce them. And the very thing that we think is helping solve problems in one dimension, we would also think would not work in other dimensions. On the other hand, even pollution and environmental problems we've been able to have considerable success at. This is a graph of sulfur dioxide emissions in the U.S. Why have sulfur dioxide emissions go down so fast? Well, a big part is because of a very successful cap-and-trade system put in to deal with acid rain. So it's a combination of governments getting together and agreeing to control themselves, combined with a very market-oriented system. Okay, I want to end with back to scary food prices. So we've been hearing a lot about this increase in food prices. Since 2000, if you take the January 2011 numbers, food prices are almost 2.5 times what they were in 2000. There are a lot of things going on here. Bad harvests in various places, possibly related to global warming, increased demand for meat in China, diversion of food into ethanol for cars. Lots of discussion of what's going on here. And I think I'd like to conclude by just saying, would I be willing to take Julian Simon's bet that food prices 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now will be lower than they are now? Would I have the optimistic scenario or the pessimistic scenario? Well, one important lesson we've seen is to look at the big picture. So remember what food prices look like as you go back. This is actually not the historically high price, contrary to what you often hear, because the FAO has a famous index that only goes back to 1990, and by that it is the historically unprecedented price. But food prices were higher in 1974. They were about the same in the early 1960s. And I think if forced to choose, I think there's a lot of things to worry about these food prices. But my guess would be that they're going to go down in the future. And part of the main lesson I want to draw from all this is that we went through an incredible period in the last 50 years with this doubling of population in just 39 years. We put pressure on resources in a way we never have before. And the challenges that we face in the future, while staggering, really are nothing compared to what we already went through and are the reason to be optimistic about the future. Okay, thank you.